At all times, when the poisoned virus of heresy attaches itself with persistence to a member of the church and transforms him into a member of Satan, extreme care should be taken to watch that the horrible contagion of this pernicious leprosy do not gain other parts of the mystic body of Christ. The decisions of the Holy Fathers have willed that hardened heretics should be separated from the midst of the just, so that the great peril of others, that this homicidal viper should not be warmed in the bosom of pious Mother Church.
Alors chambert et bien la vie, dans la douce champagne, déjoué jadis, si j'ai aimé pris.
Welcome back to the Weird Medieval Guys podcast. I'm Olivia, and this is Aaron, my traveling companion.
Bonjour. Actually, no, bonsoir.
Yes.
At this point.
And what a bonsoir it will be as we, at long last, wrap up our little 4-part series on Joan of Arc and the 100 Years' War.
So, where did we leave people when we recorded the last episode 100 years ago?
And I should apologize as well for the slight delay for this episode. Like Joan of Arc, I made a journey back to my motherland, traveled far and wide, was met with open arms by many dirty-faced peasants.
And open contempt
Exactly.
from others.
Contempt from my rivals. Unlike Joan of Arc, no one made me a suit of custom armor. But if anyone wants to, it's not too late. So, when we last left you, guys, when we wrapped up our most recent episode, Joan of Arc had just had...
She had a pretty good day.
She had had a good day. We introduced her in the beginning of the episode more formally as a young woman from a peasant family in the northeast of France. We talked about how she grew up amidst the height of the 100 Years' War, one of the most violent and destructive conflicts in European history. How she was exposed to many of the horrors of this war, and how at 13 she had her first, but certainly not her last vision, that she was being visited by angels and saints, and that they were telling her that she had to save France from its enemies. And when we left you last, seemed like things were going pretty well on that front for Joan. She set off at age 17, announced herself and her mission to the King of France, and she led a successful campaign to lift the siege of Orléans. Because these two factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, who are allied with the English, have been fighting for decades to try to defend their competing claims for the French crown. So, we last left Joan in Orléans with the jubilant defenders of the city, along with her old pals La Hire and the bastard of Orléans. And it's true that Orléans, the victory at Orléans was a huge victory for the Armagnac cause, because it sort of slightly reversed the momentum that was pretty heavily on the side of the English and the Burgundians up to that point. And so it was a huge morale boost. And it also solidified the Armagnac position along the Loire River. Generally speaking, the Armagnacs controlled south of the Loire, and the Burgundians and the English controlled north of the River Loire. And of course, the Loire River itself is a vital sort of trade artery through the center of France. Now, while Orléans had been liberated, there were quite a few towns in the Loire Valley that would have to be liberated for Orléans to be secured. So, what that meant is that the Armagnac battle line couldn't really be solidified until these three towns, Jacquereau, Meung, and Beaugency, were taken. So, after the victory at Orléans, Joan, the bastard of Orléans, and the other leaders of the defense traveled to the Armagnac royal court, which is based in Chinon, to get the Dauphin's approval for a campaign
to sort of take these towns along the Loire Valley. Now, at this meeting, Joan, in true Joan of Arc fashion, she's very forceful. She's like, no, we need to do this now. I'm not here to fuck about. Why? One of the things I find really endearing about her is how she has no time or interest in politics or really any interest in strategy.
Or diplomacy.
No, she just wants to run very fast at the people she doesn't like.
And that's what being a 19-year-old girl is all about.
So Joan pushes very, very hard for them to start a campaign now. And the Dauphin approves, and so Joan, the bastard of Orléans, and La Hire ride out with 8,000 Armagnac men to lay siege to the first town, Jargeau. Now, these towns, the thing to remember about them is they are very heavily fortified. Now, this is a legacy of the early stages of the 100 Years' War, when a key strategy of the French to resist the English invasion was to turn each town into a sort of mini fortress. But now, of course, the shoe is on the other foot, because now the English and their allies control these towns. So there were about 800 English troops at Jargeau, which gave the Armagnacs a 10-1 advantage.
Isn't it Jargeau?
Maybe. Fine, Jargeau. I may have mispronounced it. We're not cutting that. We're gonna continue.
That's fine.
Keep all this in.
And I think it's just to kind of back up slightly. I think it's worth emphasizing at this point that Joan has gone from Joan the girl to Joan the phenomenon, Joan the Maiden of Orléans, very quickly. Because she's this unknown person who, has shown up in France. A peasant girl, she's illiterate, she's a teenager, and she said, I was sent by God to lead the military to success over the English and over the Burgundians. And at the first opportunity that she's been given to prove herself, she has been successful. And now you have this teenage girl riding around in armor, in men's armor, with her hair cut short, and she's giving advice, and she's giving suggestions, and she's being very adamant about them. She's full of conviction, and people, including senior military officials, are listening to her.
Yes, so she is an international celebrity. We know that leaders across Europe were aware of her, and ordinary people across Europe gradually became aware of her over the years. And she was hugely respected within France as, potentially the person who's going to lead them to victory and to an end to this grinding, awful war that has consumed the country for almost 100 years. One of the signs of that is that, remember the Duke of Orléans?
Yes.
You want to remind people what he's up to at this point?
He's writing poetry.
He's swanning about England, writing poetry, and
going hunting.
Yes. Well, he sends Joan a gift of a tailored green velvet jacket with the arms of the city of Orléans on it, as saying, thank you very much for saving my city. Here's a coat.
I would be wearing that coat all the time. I need that coat.
It actually does seem like kind of drip. So, the Armagnacs army sets off for Jargeau. There are about 800 English troops at Jargeau, which gave the Armagnacs a 10-1 advantage in the siege. Now, here's a question for you. Do you think that that's a good thing for the Armagnacs?
I mean, it's always easier to be on the inside than the outside of a siege, I would say.
Well, yes, and some people have tried to quantify how many people you need to take a city.
What's the exchange rate?
It's 15-1 to be absolutely sure of it. You know who came up with that?
Joan of Arc.
Christine de Pizan.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, Queen. God. Because
they don't quite have the sort of the magic formula that Christine came up with. So the French commanders are quite skeptical of the idea of attacking, and so Joan comes and shouts at them again and hectors them. And says, no, God wants us to do this, so we're gonna flip and do it.
Oh, Joan of Arc definitely was like a golly gosh, HE double hockey
Yes.
sticks type.
Well, no, she hated swearing.
Yeah.
We know this because it's testified that Lahir, this grizzled soldier, had a famously bad tongue, but she was so successful at like hectoring him and telling him off that that as a result, he like stopped swearing around her because she would just shout at him. I have to say, like, one of my favorite things is sort of trying to figure out the sort of cultural equivalent of a certain sort of person or type of person in English, and I feel like Joan of Arc, she kind of has in my head, she has a Midwestern accent.
Yeah, because she's a hick.
Yes, she's from the countryside, and she's like, oh well, yeah, I don't know about this.
I don't think God really wants us to do that right now.
I'm sorry to the great people of Michigan.
Oh sure, we can take the city by siege, no problem.
How about them Packers, eh?
How about them Burgundians, eh?
So as a result, again, of her telling off all these men, in June 1429, the Armagnacs lay siege to Jargeau. Now, the assault lasted 4 hours, and according to the contemporary accounts, it was Joan herself who was leading the charge. And apparently, in the later stages of the siege, as she's climbing a ladder, a defender just throws a rock at her, lands directly on her head, which knocks her to the ground, and she just immediately climbs up and starts shouting at the French, "Up, friends, up! Our Lord has doomed the English! At this very hour, they are ours! Be of good cheer!" Which I think is very upbeat.
Yeah.
So, after that yet another amazing pep talk, Jargeau falls, and after the siege of Jargeau, they sweep through the rest of the cities in the Loire Valley with a lot of haste, conquering them fairly easily, in part because an enormous English army led by Sir John Falstaff, who was the guy who destroyed the Scottish army sent to originally liberate Orleans before Joan got there, is bearing down on them. And they need to go and deal with that, funnily enough.
Yeah. And the French are, they're enthused. They're glad that they've had some successes, but they still know that this isn't great for them because they probably, unless they can gain some kind of advantage, probably by somehow managing to work out the position and the movements of the English before the English can find them, that's probably the best chance they've got, but that's not going to be easy.
No. So, Falstaff initially planned to quarter his troops in Beaugency, but when he finds out that Beaugency has surrendered and has been taken, he actually turns his army around and starts marching back to Paris because he basically decides, well, okay, they've taken the Loire. So his army starts marching north towards Paris, and they've just about reached the town of Patay when his scouts report that an Armagnac vanguard force led by Lahir is in hot pursuit of them, followed by the main body of the Armagnac army led by Joan and the Bastard of Orleans. So, knowing that the Armagnacs are coming, Falstaff prepares a defensive formation. Basically what he does is he has the main body of his army stationed further back, and then he has a contingent of longbowmen. Remember, these are the longbows that have been absolutely devastating against French and Scottish armies throughout this entire story, so bad news. Hidden in some bushes. And the plan is they'll pop out, perforate the Armagnacs, and then the main body of the army will be able to move in and finish them off. Except their position gets revealed when, allegedly, basically just a stag runs out of the woods and startles a bunch of the men, which reveals their position to the Armagnacs, and so Lahir and his troops descend on them, massacre them, of course, because that's what you do.
Archers are wimps.
What do they got? They got knives.
Take away the big bow, and then what are they? They're just guys that couldn't cut it in the infantry.
Exactly.
Like, archers won't let you say that, but it's true.
And so the Armagnac outriders charge them and slaughter the archers, which triggers a panic in the English army, and they flee. Which means that, essentially, the battle is over before the main body of the Armagnac forces can even arrive at the scene. So another flawless victory.
Yep.
So, having done that, having liberated the Loire and won this great battle at Patay, Joan, the Bastard, La Hire, and all the other main characters of this story that we've been following, troop back to meet the Dauphin at Sully-sur-Loire. And he congratulates them and says, well done, have a gold star. But in truth, this is the point at which they have to make a crucial strategic decision. There are two roads available. Either the Armagnacs can take advantage of the momentum that they have from Orléans and Patay and push north towards Paris. Take the city, take the capital, that's a huge strategic victory. Or they can win an ideological victory by going to Reims. Now, Reims had been the site of French coronations since 1027, and you know how medieval people love a precedent. At a coronation, basically the king will get crowned with the crown of Charlemagne and anointed in the sacred chrism, which is a kind of holy oil, which is sort of a physical manifestation of his divine right to rule. Now, remember, Henry V, who is the English boy king, who is the English and Burgundian candidate for the French crown, has already been coronated in exactly this ceremony. In contrast, the Dauphin, Charles, had been disinherited by his father. So, in order to legitimize any kind of claim to the French throne, he does actually have to get coronated. So those are the two options. Take the city and take the strategic victory, or take the ideological victory. Joan, her sacred mission, her prophecy is that she will see the King of France crowned. So she cannot comprehend why you would do anything else. She says, no, we have to go and get the crown because God told me that we have to do this.
Of course, he can't actually be crowned, but they do have a coronation.
You can go through the ceremony.
The English still have the crown, the orb, and the scepter, it should be said, but they still do a ceremony.
Well, the chrism's not nothing. That is in the medieval Christian worldview. That literally that's a physical manifestation of God.
Well, yeah, because, the word Christ literally means the anointed one.
Goddamn.
Hence also the word chrism for anointing oil. So it's a powerful thing, oil.
Damn, that's deep.
Yeah, when you think about it, a lot of wars come back down. Anyways.
Wow. What is it, 2003? So, at the urging of Joan, Charles the Dauphin, basically he calls on all of his lords who are still loyal to him and assembles the largest Armagnac army that we've seen, I think, so far in this story. And it was this enormous column of men from all over France, and also remember a decent chunk of them are just Scottish people who have been along for the ride for like 20 years. Including his Varangian bodyguard of just like the 100 hardest geezers in
Yes.
Scotland.
I can't go anywhere without my emotional support Neds.
And remember, Charlotte at this point has been avoiding the front pretty much consistently since the start of the war, because he is the only thing that ties the Armagnacs to any claim to the French crown. So if he dies, it's all over. So this is a huge gamble that they're making. But On June 29th, 1429, he rides out with Joan at the head of this enormous army, which must have been a pretty incredible thing to witness. It's a real sort of Aslan is on the move kind of moment if you're an Armagnac partisan. So, the Armagnac army marches north to Reims, and they encounter pretty much no resistance until they get to the gates of the city of Troyes, where the gates are barred and the walls are well garrisoned with English troops. Now, the city of Troyes and the people of Troyes are nominally loyal to the Burgundians, but it is a bad idea to try and kill God's messenger if she does appear to you. So, in order to figure out whether or not she's legit, they sent out somebody to interview her. One of my favorite characters in the entire story, a guy named Brother Richard. So Brother Richard is this traveling Franciscan friar who has been preaching that the apocalypse is imminent and everybody needs to throw away their vices. He was a huge hit in Paris where he got a whole bunch of people to burn their chessboards.
Oh,
Because God doesn't approve of gaming.
That's true. God hates gamers.
So Richard and Joan sit down to have a one-on-one, a bit of a tete-a-tete, where he tries to figure out, again, if she is legit. What do you think he thinks of her?
Before or after?
After.
Oh, after he's like stamp of approval.
Yeah.
100%.
Which I don't think the people of Troyes were really expecting.
This girl talks to God.
He actually comes back to them with a letter that she's dictated. Which is, what I imagine is one of her sort of classic, "Fear me, mortals."
Exactly.
"I shall unleash terrible violence upon you." You know, that's sort of her mode. Which is, you have to admit, is a bit endearing.
Absolutely.
He just loves threatening people. Now, the town governors of Troyes basically say, check out this doddering old fool who's been tricked by this witch, and burn his letter, which I think is very mean, and prepare to besiege. Now, the Armagnac leaders don't really know what to make of this. So some of them are like, okay, let's just go around it. Who cares? Because, we got a hungry army. Why are we wasting time sitting outside this town who clearly hate us when we can just, again, walk around the perimeter and just leave? And so Joan, of course, is mystified by this. She's like, what are you talking about? We need to take the town. Which is, again, it's pretty classic her, I think. So, by the 16th of July, the Dauphin makes it to Reims, and the next day he is crowned with Joan standing at his side. And at this point, there's a fascinating moment during the coronation where she just breaks down. She starts sobbing as sort of the enormity of what's happened sort of hits her, I think, as a bit of a tidal wave. Because I think for her, she's been running on adrenaline probably this entire time.
Oh, yeah.
Like, she's just some random girl from this village, and she's in the middle of essentially Game of Thrones suddenly. And in the wake of the coronation, she starts getting ready to go home. She's like, well, I did it. God said, go lift the siege. It's being made on Orléans. Get the king crowned. It's over. But the Dauphin, or now as he is properly King Charles, comes to her and convinces her to stay and keep fighting for him. And that will prove to be a pretty pivotal decision. So around this time, which is like late 1429, Joan has a run-in with another woman, which is very, very interesting and revealing. So Catherine de la Rochelle is a woman who she meets in the fall of 1429, who is another prophetess who has strange visions. And she's also, unlike Joan, a mother and a married woman. She speaks to a white lady dressed in cloth of gold, who instructed her to go to the towns loyal to the king and demand silver and treasure from them in order to fund the war effort. And she comes to Joan and says, if we work together, I can get you more money, and I can get you a bigger army. And so when she comes to Joan with this suggestion, she just brushes her off. And she says later that, I told Catherine that she should return to her husband, look after her home, and bring up her children. Isn't that revealing? What I'm getting at here is, doesn't that sort of change a little bit, or challenge the way that people talk about Joan as this kind of modern feminist icon? Like, she's definitely not.
Yeah, and I think this is something that gets written out whenever we talk, we in the general sense talk about any historical women who we see as, quote, feminist icons, that they often were not just products of a system of inequality, but they often fought to uphold inequality. And just because Joan was a woman who, through a combination of circumstance and force of character, achieved these incredible things, she wasn't fighting for women. She was fighting for France.
Yeah. So, after the coronation at Reims, the Armagnac army moves on to Paris to besiege it with about 10,000 troops. Now, Paris was defended by about 3,000 English soldiers, and if you're doing the Christine de Pizan equation in your head, that's barely half of what you need. And Joan leads an assault, but the French suffer heavy casualties, and Joan herself takes a crossbow bolt to the thigh. So after a few hours, the king just calls off the attack, and the siege ends after a couple of days. And the war sort of settles back into a stalemate. So there's been this huge sort of push that's just kind of petered out. So in March 1430, the Armagnac court receives word that Philip the Good, who's the Duke of Burgundy and the key ally of England in the war, is preparing a campaign to regain some of the cities in the north of France that had declared for Charles after he was coronated, including the town of Compiègne. Now, Joan and a few of the other Armagnac leaders realized that losing those towns means losing the road north of Paris, which in turn means that it would be even harder to take Paris next time they tried. And bear in mind, they've just failed to do so. So she basically goes around to the various Armagnac leaders, basically doing her usual kind of hectoring. You know her style by now.
Yes.
And eventually convinces a few of them to send a few hundred troops with her to reinforce Compiègne. And we don't actually know whether or not she does this with the king's knowledge or consent. It's quite possible that she sets off with this kind of band of volunteers entirely sort of surreptitiously.
And I think it goes to show you the kind of fragile nature of the power and the reputation that she'd built up, that she really was this kind of golden child and everyone was looking to her during this, crucial moment that was a turning point in the war and a time when the tides were changing. But, and even though we don't know the details of all of the interactions she had after the coronation, I think it kind of goes to show you that just because she had earned people's respect didn't mean that she had their attention forever.
No.
And I can imagine there being a bit of a sense of, okay, you've done your bit, but let's be real here, you're not a military leader.
I think there's a real ambiguity here between the people who view her as a sort of spiritual leader, people like Lahir, and people who view her as a mascot. And
Yeah.
that's the tension I think that she is having to deal with every single day. So she meets up with the troops at Campania and tries to lead a surprise assault on the Burgundians who are planning to besiege it, but they basically try and launch their surprise assault and are immediately outnumbered by the much larger Burgundian army, and the Armagnac commanders order a retreat. Joan absolutely hates this, as you can imagine, so she agrees to lead the rear guard as the army retreats towards town. But when the rear guard, led by Joan, gets back to Campania, they find that the gates have been shut. And she is fucked. And she's captured pretty much immediately. And suddenly, she's in the hands of the enemy. So, Joan is captured and held as a prisoner of the Burgundians, and the English immediately start to negotiate her ransom. So basically, trying to bribe the Burgundians to hand her over. And eventually they do agree that they will pay the Burgundians 10,000 livres in order to hand her over. And a leading figure in the ransom negotiations is a man by the name of Pierre Cochon, who is the pro-English Bishop of Beauvais. Remember that name, it will become important later. So she's then transferred to an English prison in Rouen, which is the capital of Normandy, which is England's sort of oldest stronghold in France. And in January, she is put on trial in an ecclesiastical court under charges of heresy. And who is her judge? Pierre Cochon.
And to take a couple steps back, I mean, this is an absolutely huge moment for the Burgundians because they've not just captured, an enemy, but they've captured either a spiritual leader or a mascot of their enemies. They've captured a symbol, really. And I think in that context, it's absolutely not surprising that the English wanted to get a hold of her because, it must have been utterly vexing to have this young girl kind of taunting you, leading armies into battle against you and to victory. And I think it must have been absolutely infuriating. And I can only imagine that for all of the celebration and admiration that Joan got from the French, there were probably a lot of people on the other side who really wanted to knock her down a couple pegs.
Oh yeah, no, the stuff that's written about her during her own life by English sources is pretty virulent. There's a lot of witch, whore, slut, sorceress, that kind of stuff. Honestly, pretty recognizable.
Yeah.
Not much has changed in that sense. And I also think that, the English don't fully trust the Burgundians, I would suspect, either, to deliver what they see as justice.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, I think, not to give the game away too much, but I think it's also an important moment for the English and the Burgundians because Joan is such a close ally of the newly crowned king. And so it's not just about taking her out of action, but if they can find some way to discredit her, then surely that would go quite a long ways towards discrediting the king.
Absolutely.
Who became, who was crowned basically at her urging and at her direction.
And by the way, speaking of the king, you want to know who doesn't try and get her ransom?
Charles, the Dauphin.
He makes absolutely no effort.
Yeah.
And he says nothing publicly as well, although, there are sources at the time that say, he's very distressed about it. But if he's that distressed, he doesn't do anything. I'm afraid to say that he's not going to come out well in the rest of this story.
Yeah. No, he's not. And you do have to wonder because, you know, she had this amazing ascent to notoriety that was followed by a series of, you know, pretty horrible losses.
Mm-hmm.
So I do wonder, before she was captured, what the relationship between the two of them was like, if it felt like a bit of a Hail Mary going on this last mission to Compiègne.
Well, speaking of her notoriety, I think that's a really important bit of context for the trial that she's about to undergo. Because you're probably thinking at this point, well, the English have captured her. She's effectively already dead, right? Not quite. I would argue that, and I think the actual transcript of the trial, which we know in very excruciating detail, I think that backs this up. I think that what happens to Joan is absolutely contingent for a couple of reasons. Number one, they can't just summarily execute her. She's one of the most famous people in the entire Christian world. Every single king in Europe knows about her and is following this because France is one of the most important kingdoms, possibly the single most important kingdom in all of the Christian world. If they murder the emissary of God, that's bad.
Yeah.
So the trial has to be run with the absolute highest level of propriety, and they have to prove beyond reasonable doubt that she did it. Now, Joan herself, Joan doesn't have representation of the trial. She is representing herself. She is this is an interrogation. This is not a fair, neutral trial. And she is standing alone against dozens of experts in ecclesiastical law.
And, you know, we often talk about reliability and what we can take at face value when we deal with historical sources and accounts. But I think it is worth noting pretty interestingly that this trial was documented actually by 3 independent legal officers who each took their own notes and then cross-referenced them with each other's at the end of each day and made several copies of the whole account. So, of course, we can't necessarily rule out things having been changed or amended in some way, but I think that these are probably documents that are about as reliable as records from the 15th century can be.
Oh, I would go a step further. I think we've got no reason to suspect any of this is unreliable.
Yeah.
I think there's nothing in the way that Joan conducts herself in the record that is inconsistent with the personality that we've come to know, which is headstrong, stubborn, not particularly sort of politically astute, but with an absolute ironclad self-confidence. And that is her advantage, because Joan is alone, yes, and she's been abandoned by her patron, but she has 2 things that are left to her, right? She's got 2 weapons left in her arsenal, which are her mind, and remember, she's already been interrogated twice by Jean Garçon and Brother Richard, and her faith, because we know from the transcript of her trial that throughout the entire trial, pretty much until the bitter end, she thinks she's making it out of this alive.
Yeah.
She absolutely has faith that she will be rescued at the last moment. And so with those sort of last 2 weapons that she has in her arsenal, she gets ready to fight for her life.
Yeah. So in light of the extremely thorough record keeping that this trial involved, I think it's, you know, we can say with relative confidence that the trial was rigged from the start. I hate to say it, but if there was any way that you thought Joan of Arc was walking out of the hands of the English, then I'm sorry, you've got another thing coming, because they have it out for her. They want to make her look bad because that will make the Dauphin, now the king, look bad. And unfortunately, the English will basically go to any lengths to do that. And so right from the beginning, before she even appears in public, they start by doing some extremely thorough research into who she is, her background, and her personal life. And they actually send people all the way back to her hometown of Domremy.
They're very interested in the fairy tree.
Yes. And they ask all sorts of things about, to try to figure out what she was like as a child, figure things out about her family, and basically to try to see if there's anything that would incriminate her and make her seem duplicitous or untrustworthy.
Because what I think is at stake here, it's not her freedom. She's not getting out of this scot-free. That's not happening. But what is at stake for her personally is the question they are going to try and answer is Joan of Arc lying or is she consorting with demons? If she's lying, then it's possible that she might just, quote-unquote, just get imprisoned for life. Which, from Joan's point of view, is probably the preferable outcome because at least there's the prospect of release or escape. But if she's consorting with the forces of hell, she's gonna die. There's no way about it. So what she is fighting for in this trial is not her freedom, it is her life.
Yeah, and I think what they're trying to take away from her is potentially not just her life, but also her dignity.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really important thing to touch upon because, again, I really can't stress enough that the point of the trial is not just to rig it so that she's convicted of a crime, it's to humiliate her in public.
Yes.
This is an exercise, again, in ruining her reputation, to ruin the king's reputation. And even though we can't know about every single thing that happens to Joan while she's on trial or in prison, I think we can only imagine that she was not treated well. I mean...
Well, we know she got progressively sicker.
We know she got progressively sicker. We know she was harassed by guards people, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. And one of the first things that the trial starts with, or that the legal proceedings start with before she stands trial, is a physical examination to see if she's still a virgin. So you can imagine that sets the tone for the rest of what's to come. Now, she is found by the examiner to still be a virgin, and the people who go to her hometown to research her apparently can't come up with anything incriminating on her whatsoever. Apparently one of them said that he had found nothing concerning Joan that he would not have liked to find about his own sister. So you take that either of two ways, but
she's a wholesome, jolly hockey sticks girl.
No, exactly. And Pierre Cochon, who is leading the trial, is absolutely incensed by this, by all accounts. He's really pissed off because he's, asked them to do something, and they've actually not done it because their job was to dig up a bunch of dirt. And
about her sleeping with local farmhands.
Yeah, exactly. About her being a slut and talking to demons. But what they do
Two of my favorite activities.
Exactly.
Told you, rebrand starts now.
Well, you're here talking to me, so... Yes, and so in early 1431, she is brought to trial for heresy. And they question her about absolutely everything about her personal life and her childhood. They ask her about, I think this is something that's really striking if you go through the trial transcript, that they ask her about the same things over and over again.
Yes.
They're clearly hoping that she's going to trip up and reveal some sort of inconsistency in her story, at which point they can, begin to tear it apart.
Which Which is a fool's errand, because I think the thing that, what Joan's superpower is, and this is going to sound mean, but what her superpower is her absolute naivete. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I mean literally, like, she's not trying to fool anyone.
I think the main, threads that that seem to appear, in the things that Joan is saying, she repeatedly affirms her faith constantly. She affirms that she's only ever been acting on the orders of God. Whenever she's asked about what she wants or what she thinks is right, for instance, whether she thinks it's right to wear men's clothes or to lead armies into battle, she never says, I think this or I think that. She only ever says, I'm doing this because it's what God told me to do. And if I didn't think it was what God wanted, I wouldn't do it. And I think this is, as good of I think this is probably the best thing that she can say, because basically any expression of personal will or personal opinion is just going to be a trap for her. And they do try to trap her in all sorts of different ways. I think there's a very famous moment where they ask her if she believes she's in a state of grace. So, whether she has sinned recently, essentially. And this is a trick question because according to Christian doctrine, nobody knows whether or not they're in a state of God's grace. And she says simply, if I am in a state of grace, then I hope I will stay there. And if I am not in a state of grace, then let God put me there by absolving me of my sins. So when you read the transcript, I think you really can believe that she thinks that everything she's saying is true, that she is acting on the orders of God. And you can see the conviction coming through, that it's coming from somewhere that's bigger than her.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that I think is really, really, really important, and we've heard it before in the bits of the trial that we've heard already in this series, that despite being alone, despite being interrogated in this incredibly invasive way and being sort of, patronized and disrespected at every conceivable turn, she is pretty remarkably unshaken by the entire thing. Her response to, she flat out refuses to answer questions when she doesn't want to. She refuses to swear oaths when she doesn't want to. She threatens the judge.
Yeah.
With divine retribution. She is, I'd say, remarkably defiant through the entire process, in spite of everything that she's being put through. And it's kind of incredible to read.
Absolutely. And I think it would have been an absolute spectacle and a lot to stand up there in front of an audience, because medieval courthouses could be rowdy, and there were, these were public trials.
Yeah.
Anyone could show up, and there are accounts of people yelling things from the audience, sometimes derogatory things, sometimes saying things like, oh, don't answer that question, Joan, they're trying to trick you. And the publicity, again, was part of the point.
What they ultimately catch her on is not actually any of the things that she has experienced or done in her life up to this point. What they get her on is her refusal to commit to submitting to what's called a concept called the church militant. Now, the church militant basically is, in medieval thought, means the actual organs of the church as represented on earth, as opposed to, the church in heaven. Now, Joan has sworn absolute loyalty and, throughout the trial has affirmed her commitment to the word of God, but what she refuses to commit to doing is following the word of the churchmen who are in front of her, which makes sense because the churchmen who are in front of her are trying to get her killed. But ultimately, she refuses to submit to their sovereignty and to say, yes, I will, I accept your judgment no matter what it is. And you have to remember, this is somebody who feels in the deepest part of her soul that she has a personal connection with God. And here are these men who are trying to humiliate her and trying to ruin her life and kill her. And she's being asked to say that they are the embodiment of this person that she feels is in her corner. I think it's a deeply personal point, but ultimately that is her undoing.
Yeah. So she is put in prison. And from everything that we know, she does not have a very good time there. So she's allegedly mistreated by the guards. While she's in prison, they're still coming to her cell to interrogate her, to try to figure out, what they're going to do with her.
There's a bit of good cop, bad cop that goes on as well, because they send a very, very kindly priest who asks her to confess, and then they'll send like some horrible, greasy man to sort of leer at her and grope her.
Yeah. And the matter of her clothing is, and continues to be, throughout this whole period, extremely contentious. And we touched on this a bit in the last episode, but it's clear that the people who are interrogating her see the fact that she chooses to wear male clothing as extremely abnormal and extremely concerning, despite the fact that all Joan will say is that she wears that clothing because God told her to. And if God told her not to, she would stop wearing male clothing. But nevertheless, it makes her captors extremely uncomfortable. They occasionally try to force her to wear female clothing. They barter with her in various ways by saying that they'll, for instance, let her go to mass if she wears a dress, or they'll grant her privileges if she wears a dress. And she does agree to it. She does agree to it eventually.
But then they don't let her go to mass.
No, they don't. So that's not great, is it?
No.
And so for a period of time, she does wear female clothing in prison. And we're told that she is extremely uncomfortable and unhappy with this. That she protests against it and says that it makes the harassment from the guards and from men in the prison even worse. And yeah, it seems just to be this ongoing point of tension. While she undergoes this whole ordeal, they're kind of trying to wear her down and get her to confess, to sign a statement saying that she's a heretic or that she recants everything that she said about her visions coming from God. Basically just trying to get her to give up, basically.
So, on the 30th of May, 1431, a judgment is reached, and Joan is excommunicated from the church. And part of the sentence of excommunication reads as follows: that you have been on the subject of thy pretended divine revelations and apparitions lying, seducing, pernicious, presumptuous, lightly believing, rash, superstitious, a divinerous and blasphemer towards God and the saints, a despiser of God himself in his sacraments, a prevaricator of the divine law, of sacred doctrine, and of ecclesiastical sanctions, seditious, cruel, apostate, schismatic, erring on many other points of our faith, and by all these means rashly guilty towards God and Holy Church. We decree thee of right excommunicate and heretic, and after your errors have been destroyed in public preaching, we declare that you must be abandoned, and that we do abandon thee to the secular authority as a member of Satan, separate from the Church, infected with the leprosy of heresy, in order that you may not corrupt also the other members of Christ, praying this same power that, as concerns death and the mutilation of the limbs, it may be pleased to moderate its judgment. And if true signs of penitence should appear thee, that the sacrament of penance may be administered to thee.
But on the 23rd of May, 1431, Joan finally signs a document that she's presented, basically renouncing her visions and affirming that she will no longer wear men's clothing or bear arms. And the beautiful thing about Catholic doctrine is that even if, as Joan has been, you've been accused of public heresy, which is a capital crime, you can always repent, as they're giving Joan the chance to do. You can always be saved. You're not a sinner forever, as long as you don't fall back into a state of sin. And so Joan signs the document, she puts on women's clothing, and she goes back to jail.
And it seems like that's where she's going to stay for the rest of her life. Until a few days later when the trial is reconvened, because it turns out that she has now recanted her recantation. Because she has spoken to her voices and they have told her to not to lie. And the truth is that she still believes everything that she believes, and she can't. I find it really heartbreaking that even after all this, she can't bring herself to live a lie.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's really one final confrontation between Cauchon and Joan that happens on the 28th of May, where he goes to her cell with some other senior church officials and he says, "Why are you doing this?" And she says, "Because this is my truth. This is what I believe. And this is how I've been told by God to dress. And actually, when I did what you said instead of what God said and what the voices said, the voices weren't very happy with me." Unfortunately, in the eyes of her captors, this was seen as a relapse into a state of sin. So she's once again a heretic. And 2 days later, on the 30th of May in 1431, she's executed.
Well, more specifically, she's burned alive.
She is burned at the stake.
And we know from first-hand accounts, in her final moments, she just screams Jesus' name over and over again. And then, like that, she's dead.
Yeah, so she is brought to the central market square of Rouen, and she's read her sentence and tied to a pillar for execution by burning. And she asks if she can have a cross or a crucifix that she can hold, and an English soldier actually gives her one that he apparently just makes, like, right there on the spot, wanting to give her a cross that she can hold on to out of basically, like, twigs. And she thanks him and holds it, and then she is set on fire and burned alive.
It's a terrifying, awful moment. The thing that I can't help myself but wonder is whether in her final moments she heard the sound of church bells ringing. I like to hope that she did.
And do you know what they do with her bones?
They dump them in a river.
They throw them in the Seine.
Yeah. Because they can't have her body become a site of pilgrimage. God God knows, medieval Europe is crawling with relics. You can't have people showing up bearing the skull of Joan of Arc.
Well, of course, she can't be given a Christian burial if she's a sinner. But I think it is interesting that before she's executed, they actually allow her to receive her final sacraments.
That is interesting, isn't it? So, in the aftermath of Joan's death, the English authorities send a letter to the Holy Roman Emperor and to all the Christian kings of Europe and to every sort of notable lord of France, explaining that Joan is a heretic, that she's a whore, that she's a witch, that she is illegitimate. So in response, King Charles and his court say nothing. They just continue with the war. And the 100 Years' War, it just grinds on without her. She didn't manage, although she did achieve what prophecy set her to do, she didn't manage to end the war.
But I think it's worth mentioning that, that was not something that she ever claimed to be within her remit. The main thing that's endured that Joan said about the war was that she said during her trial that within the next few years, a turning point would come and it would become clear that France would be victorious, that the Armagnacs would be victorious over the Burgundians.
And indeed it did come, because in 1435, there is a peace conference. The leading figures from the Armagnac and Burgundian and English sides all sit down, including, by the way, on the English side, you'll never guess who was one of the negotiators.
On the English side, the Duke of Orleans.
Pierre Cochon.
Oh, yeah, fair. That bastard.
Yeah. And the negotiations break down immediately because it becomes clear that the Armagnacs are not going to acknowledge English sovereignty over France. And so the English sort of storm out pretty quickly. But the Burgundians don't. They are willing to negotiate. And in September 1435, a treaty is signed by both King Charles VII of France and Duke Philip the Good of Burgundy that essentially ends the conflict between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians for the first time in decades. Philip agrees to stop fighting the Armagnacs and agrees that Burgundy will recognize the sovereignty of Charles, but not in his lifetime, because it is a point of personal pride that he will never submit to the person who he still says murdered his father. For his part, Charles hands over several large territories to Burgundy and agrees to find and prosecute the murderer of Philip's father, although, they were quite probably dead at that point already, to be realistic. And this leaves the English very, very isolated. And over the next 18 years, without the help of the Burgundians, the English are driven further and further back. They lose Normandy, they lose Gascony, which were their sort of two key strongholds since before even the war began.
Yep.
And eventually all they're left with is Calais. And in 1453, at the Battle of Castillon, just a few weeks after the walls of Constantinople fell, the English are routed, and in effect, the 100 Years' War is over.
Man, what a fucking year.
Yeah, I mean, what a wild year, actually.
That's crazy.
Even though the war moved on without Joan, I think it's remarkable the extent to which people didn't. Like, the city of Orleans held an annual festival in her honor. And even in Arras, where they signed the treaty between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, people were building sculptures of her.
Yeah.
She was already a remarkable remarkable figure who was being rehabilitated in real. I don't think I don't feel like the accusations ever really stuck. I don't think people bought it.
Well, even at the time, when she was still alive and still being tried, it was not an unpopular opinion that it was a sham trial. And as much as we think of the Middle Ages as being like the historical Wild West, there were procedures and protocols, and actually legal doctrine is very deeply entrenched even in the Middle Ages. And they're
a surprisingly bureaucratic society.
Oh, very much so. And there were all sorts of controversies about people believing that the trial was unfair, about procedure not being followed. I mean, for instance, the fact that it was an ecclesiastical trial and she was being kept in a secular prison. And it was basically just this weird Franken trial where they just took bits from anywhere that they could and cobbled them all together and just did anything they could to push these accusations and to try to validate them.
And so as soon as, almost, to be honest, as soon as she's dead, the movement to rehabilitate her begins. And as early as 1455, the Pope agrees an investigation should be held into the trial and to see whether or not the results should be nullified. And the trial of nullification, as it's called, begins with this really remarkable scene where at the opening of the trial, Joan's elderly mother, who is still alive but is in her 70s at this point, addresses the trial and says the following.
I had a daughter born in lawful wedlock who grew up amid the fields and pastures. I had her baptized and confirmed and brought her up in the fear of God. I taught her respect for the traditions of the church as much as I was able to, given her age and simplicity of her condition. I succeeded so well that she spent much of her time in church, and after having gone to confession, she received the sacrament of the Eucharist every month. Because the people suffered so much, she had a great compassion for them in her heart, and despite her youth, she would fast and pray for them with great devotion and fervor. She never thought, spoke, or did anything against the faith. Certain enemies had her arraigned in a religious trial. Despite her disclaimers and appeals, both tacit and expressed, and without any help given to her defense, she was put through a perfidious, violent, iniquitous, and sinful trial. The judges condemned her falsely, damnably, and criminally, and put her to death in a cruel manner by fire. For the damnation of their souls, and in notorious, infamous, and irreparable loss to me, Isabel, and mine, I demand that her name be restored.
And at that point, Isabel breaks down in tears and has to leave because, I mean, just reading that would be, I mean, it really, I think, brings home the tragedy of losing a child.
Yeah.
Especially so young. Even, you know, at the end of the day, we can talk about, and will talk about, what this meant for history and what this meant for French culture moving forward. But at the end of the day, a child was murdered.
Yeah.
In a show trial.
Yeah.
And in 1456, the courts ruled that her conviction was null, and it was overturned, and they declared that she had been tried as a result of false articles of accusation, and it was tainted by fraud, calumny, iniquity, and contradiction, and manifest errors of fact and law. And her name is cleared.
And it's worth saying that this is, once again, quite a lengthy trial, and most of the sessions, Joan's mother, Isabel, is there. Despite the fact that her health is failing, she lives to see Joan's name cleared, and she dies the next year.
Well, she not only lived to see her daughter's name cleared, but she is in Orléans when the city holds an enormous feast to commemorate her and the Inquisitor who cleared her name.
Yeah.
Which must have been, I mean, the most... I can't even begin to comprehend what that would feel like.
Yeah. Oh, she's a very compelling character.
Yeah. I should say at this point that Joan is not declared a saint, and she isn't declared a saint until 1920. In part, I suspect, because it would have been a very controversial political decision by the Catholic Church, whilst England was still part of the Catholic Church, to declare somebody who fought against the English crown as a saint.
Yep.
But they do get around to it eventually.
Exactly.
And I think if you want to understand the way that she is thought about and understood at the time, even before her name is cleared, the anecdote that I think about the most is a throwaway story from a Burgundian visitor to Constantinople 2 years after her death, who finds himself talking to a imperial servant who asks him, "Oh, and by the way, whatever happened to Joan the maid?" And he tells this servant the story of Joan and the story of how she died. And he says, "It seemed to the Greeks an impossible thing. And when he told them what had become of her, they were filled with wonder." I don't know. I like to think of them there, sitting in the moldering ruins of that great city, with Joan's name just hanging in the air. So, that's the story of the 100 Years' War. From the graceless death of Alexander III over 150 years previously, all the way to the death of Joan of Arc and its aftermath.
Yeah.
But guess what? There's still probably like half an hour left on this episode.
Buckle up.
Yeah.
Now it's time to talk about us and our feelings.
No.
Well, kind of.
Now it's time to talk about we've done the narrative history. Now it's time to do real history. That's right. Narrative history isn't real history.
Actually, objective facts. No, just kidding. There's no such thing.
You live on like the 3rd floor of this building. I can throw you out of it.
No, you can't because the windows don't open far enough.
Get enough speed,
Oh,
and
yeah,
I can
you're
break
right,
the window.
Actually, damn, double glazing gonna hurt.
In many ways, this story has been the story of 4 nations: France, Scotland, England, and Wales. And I think it's worth underscoring what the outcome of that war meant for each of these countries. For France, there's no way around this. The 100 Years' War was apocalyptically calamitous for France. And I think it's to understand why, I think we have to take a step back and do a bit of a sort of analysis as to what it actually represented. First of all, the initial English invasion and the French response was pathetic. They were utterly outclassed by a poorer, smaller country, leading to what you could describe as a political crisis in the monarchy. Added to that, the Black Death, which in addition to being a virulent plague that massacred millions of people across the country, it also represented a utter failure of state capacity. The medieval state, I mean, all medieval states, but France in particular, because there was a war happening, were completely ill-equipped to deal with this, right? And the victory of France under Charles VII is, although there are revolts and conflict with the nobility that follow in the wake of the end of the war, I think that this is the point at which French rulers get to, after the chaos of the last 100 years, get back on the track that they were on before the war, which was increasing their power and increasingly centralizing power in their own hands at the expense of the great lords, which of course was the thing that started the entire war in the first place. And I think that's part of the reason why France is, relative to other countries in Western Europe, by the 18th century, becomes a relatively centralized state and a relatively archaic one.
Yeah.
The ancien régime, some call it. And of course, because it hasn't had that kind of reboot point since the 100 Years' War, when crisis hits at the end of the 18th century, the edifice of the French state just crumbles. And the prophecy of Marie Robin all those years ago, that the French monarchy would drown in blood and they would say, "Here was Paris," came true after all.
There you go.
So that's France. Scotland. The 100 Years' War is not actually a very significant story in Scottish national imagination, in part because I think our record in it is quite mixed.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. It depends. I think you've often talked about the idea of a long Middle Ages, and the Middle Ages ending at certain times. And I think maybe this podcast episode series has been an exercise in the notion of the long 100 Years' War, where if you just stretch it out to include the events that, Alexander's death and all of the events immediately after that in Scotland, I think we can say that, this was absolutely a formative time for Scottishness as an identity, especially Scottishness as an identity that exists in opposition to Englishness.
Yes, absolutely. And by the way, this is something that is true of all of England and France as well. French and English people increasingly see themselves as opposites, as it were. And very importantly, an idea starts to form that not only are French and English people different, because, medieval people had their ideas about there being nations, and they have different characters and so on. But the idea that, no, it is illegitimate for a French person or for an English person to run France. This is where that starts. Because that would have been completely normal.
And vice versa, because up until really the end of the 15th century, what was the language that was spoken by the English aristocracy? It was French.
Yes.
Everyone spoke French. Everyone, despite these people, or Anglo-Norman, it would be more proper to say, and despite these people being born in England, largely, many of them being born in England, they were very much part of, I think, a cultural continuum that that very much included France. It's not to say they were literally French people, but they definitely saw themselves as, and, had very close links with the French aristocracy, and this...
And the same is true, by the way, of the Scottish aristocracy. I mean, we talked about this as this cultural continuum at the start of the first episode, and this story is in many ways the story of how that breaks down.
Yeah.
And you have two blocks, which are essentially England and Ireland, who has been largely excluded from this story because Ireland is dominated by England throughout this period.
Yeah.
England and Ireland against Scotland and France. And that will persist until the 17th century. But I think that the reason, to return to Scotland for a second, I think that not only is it a formative experience in terms of the construction of national identity, but it's also, this is the way that the French victory in the 100 Years' War is the thing that guarantees Scottish independence. Remember, when Robert Bruce dies, the political settlement that he managed to negotiate of a Scottish kingdom independent from England is so unstable that it breaks down pretty much the second his body cools.
Yep.
Whereas what actually consolidates Scottish independence and makes it a viable thing long term when England is a hostile power down the road,
yeah,
is having a big scary friend with a big stick,
yep,
called France, who can be called upon for help. So it's an amazing deterrent. So that is why I think that we have to tell these two stories together.
Absolutely.
Because none of the things that trigger, all the things that trigger the Scottish Wars of Independence are exactly the same things that trigger the 100 Years' War. So that's Scotland. What does it mean for England?
Well, England, thankfully can't bother Scotland or France too much in the following decades, because having lost to France, England is plunged into chaos. There's infighting. I mean, the Wars of the Roses.
There's economic crisis.
Henry
V comes of age, and it turns out that he may have inherited a bit too much from his maternal grandfather, by which I mean he's the grandson of King Charles VI, the one who went mad and started trying to murder his associates. So he's troubled with mental health issues throughout his life and is just generally regarded as a very poor king.
Yeah.
And when he's gone, the country descends into this very long, very bloody civil war. Like you say, the Wars of the Roses between the houses of Lancaster and York.
Yep. And one of the results of this, having touched upon this whole idea of Englishness, and especially Englishness as, in relation to the English language becoming more of an established, less nebulous concept, is that now, for the first time in around 500 years, England actually has rulers who speak English as their first language. But they actually don't come from England.
Yes, the winners of the Wars of the Roses come from a very unexpected place. They don't come from the hallowed halls of London. They don't even come from the moorlands of England's far north. They come from the west. The man who will be King of England lands first on the west coast of Wales. He rallies support by calling upon the ancient power of the Welsh bards to spread his fame and fortune. He marches under the banner of the Red Dragon. His ancestors fought with Owain Glyndŵr and Llewellyn, the Welsh prince that Edward I vanquished. His family were not famous in England at the time, but you certainly know his name now. His name is Henry Tudor. And for many Welsh people, although he did not speak Welsh and did not live in Wales for most of his life, this was the fulfillment of the ancient prophecy of Amab Daragan, the son of prophecy, that says that after 1,000 years of English domination, a Welshman will sit on the throne of Britain once again. And the Tudors, they don't ultimately do very much for Wales. In fact, it's Henry VIII who ends the even nominal level of independence that Wales still had in the English realm. But what they do is usher England into the modern age. It's the Tudors who introduced Protestantism. It's the Tudors who found the first English colony in the Americas. These are the people who will build modern England, and it is from the fires of the 100 Years' War that they will emerge.
I mean, if you look at the Tudors, just each monarch, I think pound for pound, they definitely
And Henry VIII's got a lot of pounds.
had the best. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, but also, very dense people. They packed a lot of pounds into a small amount. No, I'm losing the metaphor here. But basically, I think safe to say, they definitely contributed a disproportionate amount to English and to some extent other parts of some places that may or may not be considered British identity. And what about Joan? It would be doing her a little bit of a disservice, I think, to close this episode without just talking a little bit about Joan herself as a character, as an icon, as a girl, as a woman. What makes her so compelling, and what is it about this story that we keep coming back to, and what allowed her story to happen in the first place?
On one level, there's so many layers to it, I think. There's so many things that make her a unique figure, I think. Her gender and the way that she subverts gender norms, whilst also at the same time upholding them for other people, I think is a really interesting contradiction. I think class is another thing that gets written out of the Joan of Arc narrative quite a lot. This is a working class woman, and this is a working class woman who's living in an era of tremendous working class unrest. I mean, you have in the same general period, you have the peasants' revolts in England, you have the tumult of the Ciompi in Florence. I mean, the working class are arriving on the field of history in a real way in the 15th century. And by the way, you can see that, I think, in the Joan story, like throughout the narrative, whether it's the militia that she assembles in Orleans, or the ordinary people who Brother Richard gets to open the gates at Troyes, or even the people in the stand saying, "Don't let him get you down, Joan.
Yep.
You're a girl boss." The story is full of ordinary people.
Absolutely. And I think that it's, incredible and incredibly unique that she was embraced by both the aristocracy and the everyman, so to speak. I mean, I think there's this kind of idea in political theory that I've already mentioned, that I will be mentioning briefly, of the body politic as, perceiving a group of people within a political system as kind of one cohesive actor. Not that they're all of one mind, but that a population can almost act, can experience some of the same things a person does in terms of shifts of opinion and trajectory. Go on.
And can express a general will.
And I think often as well, it's perceived that, the head, so to speak, of this body politic, especially in this era, is a monarch or a ruler. But I think what's really unique about Joan is that she feels like she was kind of an expression of will or intention or values for the entire people.
I absolutely agree. I think that her story is so improbable that there's no way that any of it happens without her being the embodiment of something deeper and bigger, something that needed an outlet. We've already talked in this episode about the 100 Years' War being this foundational experience for national identity in England, France, Scotland, Wales, everywhere that it touched. And but it's also a foundational moment for nationalism. Remember, the the Scottish Wars of Independence end with the Declaration of Arbroath, which is exactly an expression of this idea of the general will. But as we talked about in that episode, the Declaration of Arbroath is a very, in the subtext of it, is a very exclusive definition of that idea of the body politic. The body politic is the political class, so the aristocracy and the clergy. What I think Joan is almost an unwitting expression of is the expansion of that, and that idea that the body politic can include people like her, an illiterate peasant girl, who can, in the sense that not only can she act as a political actor, but also that people like her are part of the political community of the nation. She is the smashing together of these ideas that are already in the ether, but she gives it physical form. And by the way, if you're starting to think, well, that's a bit of a stretch, think about the iconography of nationalism in every single country you've ever seen, and ask yourself, why does almost every single country, when representing the nation as an abstract concept, pick a woman carrying a flag?
And I think on the topic of women, I mean, Joan of Arc, is she a girl boss, yes or no, has been dragged through the absolute mud, and I'm not really going to subject you guys to more of that, nor am I going to subject you guys to more of Joan of Arc. Was she schizophrenic? But I do think it's interesting not discussing Joan herself, but discussing people's reactions to her and the way that a woman's legacy gets kicked around like a football. Because, you know, her trial while she's alive is politically motivated. Her trial while she's dead is arguably also politically motivated. Because she's an icon, she's a figure, and
it's the trial of the century.
It's the trial of the century, and I think it's safe to say that her womanhood and her femininity and the unique way in which she expressed them were a massive part of what lets her be so iconic, you know, from when she was alive until now. I mean, it's hard to imagine people rallying behind, you know, Joan of Arc as much if she was a guy. I mean, the image of the young, tiny, teenage girl in armor with a sword holding a banner, I mean, that's so powerful.
Well, because she's saying, I shouldn't be here.
Exactly.
This isn't my job.
And, you know, despite that, I think it was also, her gender also no doubt was what allowed the Burgundians and the English to subjugate her, to subject her to so much, to harass her and abuse her, and treat her like she was crazy, to make all sorts of insinuations and violations of her physical body. And I just think it's this interesting kind of contrast where people are very attached to the idea of a woman as a symbol, but less attached to the idea of female agency. And I think it's something that you still see today. It's something that I've thought about a lot in conjunction with Christine de Pizan, and I've talked about it with Aaron, I'm sure, at great length already. But I think it's fascinating that, like, Joan of Arc is still seen as kind of a vessel, even for modern femininity. I mean, she's kind of become a vessel for people's like Sylvia Plath, 50s housewife, you know, manic, oh, she's a crazy girl. Because I think people see it as like very sexy and very sexual to be a woman who is delusional. That's a word you hear all the time. A woman who has delusions of grandeur, or a woman who is, you know, not quite there, but in a way that's small and fragile and sexy, as we're supposed to presume Joan of Arc was in her day. And I think it's sad because people, you know, for the past 600 years have never wanted to ascribe rational rationality to women. And I think we still kind of deny Joan of Arc that in the way that she's aestheticized and represented in basically all sorts of media. I think it's really sad because while people will say, oh, you know, she was a schizophrenic girl and that's so fascinating, people also will use that to deny any parts of her that they find uncomfortable, like her issues with, you know, other women and the way that she treated them and the fact that she was a 15th century woman.
In terms of gender, I think we talked before we started making these episodes. I think I said that I wanted to avoid the virgin suicidesification
Yes.
of Joan of Arc, which is to say, I think that I really object to the way that Joan... Sorry, let me take this different way. After making this series, I find the way that Joan of Arc is portrayed, even in modern pop culture, to be really distasteful.
Yeah.
Because I think, what is the image of her that we stick with? It's of her, you know, on her knees, beseeching her Lord. Oh,
Yeah.
give me the strength for this.
And she's usually wearing like a long skirt
Yes.
or a dress.
Which is ironic because that is an incredibly medieval way of portraying a female martyr.
Yes.
As we talked about in the feminism episode, women can achieve incredible things within the sort of cosmology of medieval Christianity, but only within this very, very specific mold and of passivity and of acceptance of suffering.
Yes.
Whereas I think there are maybe a few hours of Joan's life that are like that. Whereas, I mean, she is, for the rest of her life, she is kicking and clawing and biting and fighting every single step of the way. She's fighting her allies. She's fighting for her life in the court. She is this incredibly dynamic and active woman who takes control of her own destiny. The other reason why I think dwelling on the tragedy and the end of the story is so wrong is because it doesn't really give enough credit to the joy and the hope that she represented for people at the time. I think she was a harbinger of relief and freedom from unimaginable suffering that had continued up to that point. And ironically, I think there's no better expression of that than a text that we've already read a little bit of in this series. Christine de Pizan's Ode to Joan of Arc, which of course was written during Joan's life, but I think functions as a far better eulogy for her than maybe anything that has been written since she died.
I, Christine, who have wept for 11 years in a walled abbey, where I have lived ever since Charles, how strange this is, the king's son, fled in haste from Paris. I, who have lived enclosed there on account of the treachery, now, for the first time, begin to laugh. I begin to laugh heartily for joy at the departure of the wintry season, during which I was wont to live confined to a dreary cage. But now I shall change my language from one of tears to one of song, because I have found the good season once again, well endured my share. In 1429, the sun began to shine again. It brings back the good new season, which had not really been seen for a long time. And because of that, many people had lived out their lives in sorrow. I myself am one of them. But I no longer grieve over anything, now that I can see what I desire. Blessed be he who created you, Joan, who were born at a propitious hour. Maiden sent from God, into whom the Holy Spirit poured his great grace, in whom there was and is a great abundance of noble gifts. Never did Providence refuse you any request. Who can ever begin to repay you? And what more can be said of any other person? or of the great deeds of the past. Moses, upon whom God in his bounty bestowed many a blessing and virtue, miraculously and indefatigably led God's people out of Egypt. In the same way, blessed Maid, you have led us out of evil. For if God performed such a great number of miracles through Joshua, who conquered many a place and cast down many an enemy, he, Joshua, was a strong and powerful man. But, after all, a woman, a simple shepherdess, braver than any man ever was in Rome. As far as God is concerned, this was easily accomplished. But as for us, we never heard tell of such an extraordinary marvel. For the prowess of Ael, the great men of the past cannot be compared to this woman, whose concern it is to cast out our enemies. This is God's doing. It is He who guides her, and who has given her a heart greater than that of any man.
Well, I think it's time that we bid farewell to the 100 Years' War and to Joan and to all the other characters that we've met along the way. Olivia, what have you learned?
I actually learned, this isn't something I learned, it's just something I came up with just now. I actually think it's really brilliant that we simulated the 100 Years' War by stretching our release schedule for these 4 episodes over 100 years. No, just kidding. And that was my fault for going to America, which I will never do again.
Yeah, it's dead to you now. So, Olivia, where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Weird Medieval, or my personal is at Olivia__MS. And Aaron?
You can find me at Aaron P. Tappers on Twitter, or just at Aaron on Blue Sky. I am going to try posting on Blue Sky more, because Twitter is bad.
Twitter is so bad. Twitter is cooked.
It scares me at the moment. It's not making me happy. I don't like being there. But unfortunately, that's where I get the validation of social media attention.
But we like podcasting for you.
Yes.
And we thank you very, very kindly for listening to this episode of the Weird Medieval Guys podcast.
So, if you liked this episode, be sure to leave us a 5-star review on your podcast catcher of choice. And if you really liked it, you can leave us a comment on Spotify, like Louisa did, who said, "I've listened to all your episodes 3 times over. I need more." Well, here's more. This is a lot more. This is actually, I think, probably going to be the longest episode we've ever done.
You're welcome. Longest and least accessible.
That you need to have committed 3.5 hours to this already to get any of this.
Yeah, if you're listening to the outro of the last episode, the 2.5 probably hour final episode of the Weird Medieval Guys 4-part series on the 100 Years' War and Joan of Arc, then give yourself a pat on the back and drop a comment.
Also,
because I want to know.
Big up all the people who were excited about Wishbone.
Yeah. Thank you guys. Wish Gang unite.
Well, take it easy. Well, that's the end of the story. It's mental, eh? When they were putting Big J on trial, I was pure like that. Well, I'd best be on my way. I've got a busy night ahead of me. Hope you enjoyed the tale. What's that? Who am I? Don't worry, I'll tell you. Some other time. Cheerio.